Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are digging into a conflict that might not involve missiles, not directly anyway, but it dictates the future of, well, everything that moves, generates power, or defends a nation. We are talking about the escalating U.S.-China geopolitical rivalry, and it's centered entirely on these essential materials that make the 21st century work: critical minerals.
That's exactly right. And, when analysts talk about critical minerals, we are far beyond traditional commodities like iron ore or copper. We are discussing lithium, rare earths, cobalt, graphite, things like that.
The really high-tech stuff.
Precisely. These are indispensable building blocks for the modern strategic sector. You see them everywhere. I mean, in the batteries of electric vehicles, doesn't matter if it's a Tesla or a BYD from China, in those massive wind turbines driving the clean energy transition.
Oh.
And crucially, in pretty much every high-tech defense platform. Think about the radar systems on an F-35 jet or the sonar rays on nuclear submarines. This link, this inextricable link between national security needs and sustainability goals, well, that's what we call the security-sustainability nexus.
Okay, the security sustainability nexus. Let's unpack this. We've got sources detailing China's, well, near total market dominance in some areas, and the intense multi-front response now being launched by the U.S. and its key allies. So our mission for you, the listener, is to understand exactly how China manufactured this choke point, what this coordinated multi-billion-dollar counter strategy actually looks like, and, maybe most importantly, what difficult, really costly choices resource-rich partners like Australia are currently being forced to make.
Well, the defining characteristic of this whole conflict is the overwhelming concentration of control, and this is critical to grasp. The bottleneck, the real problem, is rarely the mining itself.
Not digging it out of the ground.
Not usually, no. The raw materials might be spread across the globe. Australia, for instance, is incredibly rich in lithium. But the difficulty, the real choke point, lies in the highly complex, energy-intensive, and often quite toxic stages of processing, refining, and specialized manufacturing.
So China dominates the transformation process, not necessarily the digging, is that?
Exactly. The numbers are, well, they're staggering. If you look at the refining stage for 19 out of 20 strategic minerals tracked by the U.S. government, China holds an average market share of 70%.
70% average. Wow. That concentration alone tells a huge part of the story. But let's get specific. Let's talk about the sectors the U.S. cares about most: clean energy and defense.
Okay. If we look at the electric vehicle supply chain, China controls something like 80% of global lithium chemical production. Then 78% of cathode production, that's basically the heart of the battery, and 70% of the actual cell manufacturing capacity.
So start to finish, almost.
Pretty much. And when we move to high-tech magnets, which are absolutely critical for precision motors in EVs, but also defense guidance systems, China's share of sintered permanent magnets has just skyrocketed. It went from maybe 50% 2 decades ago to 94% today.
94%. That's not just market leadership. That sounds like a strategic monopoly on the finished product.
It effectively is.
So how did they pull off this industrial chokehold? I mean, this couldn't have been accidental.
Oh, far from it. This was a clear, decades-long strategic vertical integration strategy, and it was heavily backed and subsidized by the state. They ensured their supply security by deploying what are called off-take contracts globally.
Off-take contracts?
Yeah, this is where Chinese processing plants provide the necessary capital, sometimes the resources, the engineering expertise to develop mines in other countries, often in Africa or South America. In exchange, they get the entire long-term supply locked up.
And we see that play out even in allied territory, don't we? Our sources mention companies like Ganfeng getting involved in projects as far afield as the U.S. and Argentina, securing that supply right at the source.
Absolutely. And domestically, they used clear policies, like the now-retired battery whitelist, specifically to favor their national champions, helping them scale up incredibly fast. And, crucially, they deployed predatory tactics to crush any external competition that tried to stand up a Western supply chain.
Right. This is where the market itself becomes a weapon. Our sources detail how, just as Western miners tried to exploit domestic lithium reserves in the U.S., Chinese refiners systematically drove down lithium prices by a massive 80% over the last year, just through aggressive dumping and overproduction.
That's a classic move, unfortunately. Flood the market, make those domestic Western projects immediately unprofitable, and drive U.S. miners into, well, financial distress. It effectively weaponizes market mechanisms to maintain their dominance.
So first build dominance, then defend it aggressively.
And now, having achieved that dominance, they're using it as a direct geopolitical tool. Beijing, you see, views U.S.-led alliances, particularly in the Indo-Pacific like the QYA, as containment strategies aimed at China, and their response has been to restrict exports of these critical materials.
We first saw this with gallium and germanium, right? Materials vital for semiconductors. The U.S. is almost completely dependent on China for gallium imports, something like 100%.
Correct. And then came the expanded controls on 7 specific rare earth elements, things like neodymium, dysprosium, and even the processing equipment used to refine them. But what's really fascinating here is how China dramatically widened the net in the latest round of controls.
Right. They didn't just restrict materials from China, they started policing what the rest of the world does with Chinese materials.
Exactly. This new rule, it requires foreign companies to get a license to export internationally made products. If those products contain more than just 0.1% of Chinese-sourced rare earth materials by value.
0.1%. That's tiny.
It is. Think about the impact of that threshold. It means if, say, a Japanese magnet manufacturer uses even a tiny fraction of Chinese processed rare earth, they now need permission from Beijing to sell that finished magnet globally. It gives China oversight and potentially veto power over entire global industrial value chains, automotive, energy, defense, you name it.
Okay, this brings us directly to the Allied counterstrategy. The West has clearly woken up to this. They've recognized this is a concentrated security risk, and they're launching a coordinated defense. Let's look at the financial and diplomatic effort first.
So this strategy is really built on what they call minilateral partnerships. These are frameworks that specifically exclude China and other countries of concern. The most prominent one is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or QUIWA, Critical Minerals Partnership. That involves the U.S., Australia, India, and Japan, focusing on friendshoring these supply chains among trusted partners.
Friendshoring, building it with allies.
Exactly. And then you have the broader international framework, the Mineral Security Partnership, or MSP.
Right, what's that?
The MSP is kind of the multilateral muscle. It includes the G7 countries, other key allies, and the EU Commission, 12 entities in total, all focused on channeling investment and expertise into securing resilient supply chains. And the financial commitments here are starting to look significant. The U.S., for example, plans to launch a $1 billion fund just for the Q80 countries to accelerate projects.
Hang on, let me jump in there. $1 billion. You just told us China invested potentially hundreds of billions over decades to build this monopoly. Is a $1 billion fund really enough? Aren't we fighting I don't know, a land war with what amounts to a BB gun here?
That's a really critical question. And the consensus seems to be that the fund itself, the $1 billion, is more symbolic. The real financial muscle comes through integrated policy and trade agreements. Probably the biggest financial lever the U.S. has deployed is designating Australia as a domestic source under the Defense Production Act, the DPA.
The DPA, what does that designation actually mean in practical terms for, say, an Australian mine?
It's huge. It means Australian companies are now eligible to benefit directly from the massive $369 billion in clean energy incentives offered by the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, in the U.S.
Ah, the IRA.
The IRA is a potential game changer. It subsidizes pretty much everything, from EV battery manufacturing right back to raw material processing, provided the supply chain excludes adversaries, meaning China, primarily. So this DPA designation essentially treats Australia like another state in the U.S., but just for critical mineral purposes. It opens up enormous public and potentially private capital pools.
Okay, so the money is moving, the alliances are forming, but financial incentives only really work if you have strong legal guardrails in place, right? What are the policymakers doing right now to ensure these new Western industries aren't just instantly undercut again?
Yeah, that takes us to the legislative front. In the U.S. Congress, there's a Critical Minerals Policy Working Group, the PWG. They're focused on plugging the current loopholes. Because remember, the PRC still supplies over half of 24 key U.S. critical minerals. So they're focused on protecting the nascent U.S. recycling and processing industries.
And that involves controlling what's leaving the U.S., specifically recycled material, you mean?
Precisely. They've drafted bills to implement U.S. export controls on black mass and swarf.
Black mass and swarf.
Right. Black mass is the critical intermediate product you get from recycled batteries. It's full of valuable metals. And swarf refers to the magnet byproducts, like shavings or dust from manufacturing. Why control these? Because foreign adversaries, essentially the PRC, were apparently scooping up this high-value recycled material at cut-rate prices.
Undermining U.S. recyclers before they even got started.
Exactly. It prevents the development of a fully closed-loop supply chain inside North America. So the legislative goal is keep that valuable material here.
Okay. Meanwhile, the EU is looking inward, focusing on strategic self-sufficiency.
That's right. Their Critical Raw Materials Act, it sets ambitious goals. 10% domestic extraction and 40% domestic processing across the continent by 2030. That's a massive commitment to try and build long-term stability and de-risking.
Okay, let's shift to the final line of defense, maybe the most interesting part. Targeted technology and these innovative financial mechanisms. This is where the strategies get highly technical and, frankly, pretty clever. You mentioned the U.S.-Australia agreement, mobilizing $3 billion total investment. But the really critical mechanism introduced here is establishing a price floor for certain critical minerals.
Yes, this is a really sophisticated anti-dumping tactic. It's essentially a strategic insurance policy that the government or a consortium is underwriting. Remember how we said China can crash lithium prices by 80% to kill off Western projects?
Right, make them unviable overnight.
A price floor changes that whole calculus. So if China tries to flood the market and sell lithium for, say, $50 a unit, the price floor ensures that the Western producer is still guaranteed a higher viable price, let's say $100 by the government or maybe a group of buyers.
So the price floor makes Western projects bankable again. It attracts private capital because investors know the government has essentially removed that existential risk of predatory dumping by China. That's actually brilliant.
It aims to make Western viability instantaneous, countering that artificial competitiveness driven by state subsidies. And the final piece of this technology puzzle involves leveraging key allies who have advanced manufacturing knowledge, particularly Japan.
Japan is the technology card here, is that right?
Absolutely. The U.S. signed an agreement with Japan. Remember, Japan's a $4.28 trillion economy. Their National Energy Agency, Joe Tremec, is transferring advanced extraction tech and, crucially, high-performance magnet technology. We're talking neodymium iron boron magnets, the really strong ones.
The ones needed for F-35s and advanced EVs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Japan has the deep know-how in the precise manufacturing required for defense and high-end EVs, and they're now accelerating supply chain autonomy in the West by sharing that expertise, helping set up facilities in North America, like our alloys.
And beyond these partnerships, are there disruptive technologies emerging? Things aimed at bypassing that difficult processing hurdle entirely?
Yes, there's definitely heavy investment in alternative sourcing. Things like deep-sea mineral nodule. Harvesting these nodules on the ocean floor contain valuable cobalt, nickel, manganese. And on the processing side, we're seeing the commercialization of new technologies. One example is flash joule heating.
Flash joule heating.
Yeah, uses high-voltage electrical pulses. The simple takeaway is that it drastically reduces waste, maybe by 90%, and it cuts processing time from hours down to mere seconds. So it offers potentially a much cleaner, much faster path to refined material. And it's being scaled up in places like Texas right now.
So we see this global strategy emerging. Financial incentives, legal protections, tech transfers, innovation. But this geopolitical alignment, it forces incredibly difficult choices on partners caught in the middle, like Australia, which is, as you said, incredibly rich in critical minerals, especially lithium.
Yeah, Canberra is caught in a really difficult squeeze. Analysts we looked at note they're being pushed to apply a kind of zero-sum geopolitical logic that often seems to trump economic rationality. Think about it. Australia's traditional relationship with China was very economically rational. Australia supplies the raw ore. China, the world's biggest battery maker, buys it and processes it. Simple.
But the U.S. funds, especially those tied to the IRA, come with strings attached that directly target that very economic rationality.
They absolutely do. To access those huge pools of U.S. government financing and incentives, Australian companies have to adhere to strict rules. The key one is, foreign entities of concern, which explicitly includes Chinese investors, cannot hold more than a 25% stake. That's ownership, voting rights, or even board seats.
And that 25% threshold, that forces existing Australian-Chinese joint ventures, like some key lithium projects involving giants like Ganfeng and Tanki, to fundamentally rethink or maybe even break up their businesses.
Exactly. And that carries huge economic risk for Australia. China isn't just standing still watching this happen. If Australia fully aligns with a U.S. strategy and forces a decoupling, China's clean energy giants like the battery maker CATL or the EV maker BYD, they'll likely just aggressively develop alternative critical mineral sources elsewhere.
Where would they look?
Well, they already have their sights set on markets in Africa, Latin America, maybe even Russia, which, remember, holds the fourth largest global supply of rare earths.
And the practical challenge for Canberra is immediate, right? You can't just turn off the tap on China overnight. finding alternative markets with processing capacity even remotely comparable to China's scale. Our sources say that will be challenging in the short term, to put it mildly. It means serious, measurable economic costs for Australia right now.
It's a real-world policy contradiction playing out.
Yeah.
While diversification is necessary, maybe even economically justifiable in the long term, forcing a rapid, geopolitically driven split severely affects the Australian mining sector today. We're seeing political leaders in Western Australia being very vocal about this, pointing out that China is simultaneously their biggest customer for raw materials and their biggest supplier of many finished elements needed for their own manufacturing base. It's a tough spot.
So, if we try to synthesize all this, the long-term success of this whole allied counter strategy really hinges on overcoming what you called earlier China's artificial competitiveness.
Exactly. China's dominance isn't just about smart early investment, though that was part of it. It's also about massive, sustained state subsidies, enormous scale advantages built over time, and frankly, a history of allowing for much lower environmental protection standards, which keeps their operational costs down significantly. Things like potentially the use of forced labor in some areas, or just higher pollution associated with extraction and refining.
So, the allied strategy is betting that resilient, distributed supply chains built on higher standards, transparency, and technology will ultimately be strategically superior to one centralized, potentially vulnerable system, even if it costs more initially.
That's the bet. But the timeline is unforgiving. As our sources noted, even getting a new lithium hydroxide plant online, a core part of this counter strategy, can easily take 5 to 6 years from planning to operation. This requires time, significant capital, and maybe most importantly, sustained cross-government political will, which can be fragile.
Right. Political cycles change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the key takeaway, maybe, is this. Economic dependence on authoritarian regimes, especially for materials that underpin both your national defense and your economic future, is now broadly recognized across the West as an unacceptable risk.
A risk we can no longer ignore.
Precisely. And this raises a profound and necessary question for every major economy involved, really. What is the true, comprehensive long-term cost of achieving strategic independence in these critical sectors? And can that necessity ever be permanently balanced against the very real, very tempting short-term benefits of price stability and cheap manufacturing that dependence might offer? It's a calculation every nation is grappling with right now. What's the real price of security versus stability?